Welcome back to English Podcast, dear listeners, to Literary Landscapes, where we delve deep into the worlds woven by the masters. Today, we're revisiting a story that has resonated through generations. A powerful and intensely personal narrative. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre.
Indeed. This isn't just a romance, though passion certainly ignites its pages. It's a profound exploration of a young woman's unyielding quest for love, belonging, and most importantly, self-respect in a world that often sought to deny her all three. Bronte gives us an intimate first-person account of Jane's life, a true Bildungsroman tracing her arduous journey from a despised orphan to an independent woman.
Our story opens with a chilling sense of isolation. We meet Jane Eyre as a small, plain, and fiercely intelligent 10-year-old girl, an unwelcome ward at Gateshead Hall. She lives under the shadow of her aunt, by marriage, Mrs. Reed, a woman whose heart seems as cold and hard as the grand, unwelcoming house itself.
Mrs. Reed had promised her dying husband she would care for Jane as one of her own. It was a promise she spectacularly failed to keep. Instead, she harbors a deep-seated resentment for the child, viewing her as an outsider, a burden. Jane is systematically excluded from the family circle, subjected to constant criticism and emotional neglect.
Her three cousins, Eliza, Georgiana, and particularly the odious John Reed, only amplify her misery. John, a stout and bullying 14-year-old, takes sadistic pleasure in tormenting Jane, both physically and emotionally. He reminds her constantly of her dependent status, telling her she has no business to take our books. "You are a dependent," Mama says. "You have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg, and not to live here with gentlemen's children like us."
One bleak November afternoon, this simmering tension boils over. After John Reed hurls a book at Jane, striking her and drawing blood, Jane, in a moment of desperate self-defense and accumulated rage, finally retaliates, flying at him like a mad cat. This act of defiance, however justified, is seen by Mrs. Reed as proof of Jane's inherently wicked and passionate nature.
Her punishment is swift and terrifying. Confinement in the Red Room. This grand, seldom-used chamber is where her uncle, Mr. Reed, had died 9 years prior. It's a place heavy with oppressive silence, dark crimson furnishings, and for Jane, overwhelming fear. Locked in, alone with her terror and a profound sense of injustice, Jane's imagination runs wild. She believes she sees her uncle's ghost, a vision born of fear and a child's desperate longing for a protector. Her frantic screams are dismissed by Mrs. Reed, and Jane eventually faints from sheer terror and emotional exhaustion. This traumatic experience leaves an indelible mark on her psyche, a recurring symbol of her childhood suffering and isolation.
Following this ordeal, Jane falls seriously ill. Mr. Lloyd, the kindly family apothecary, is called. Unlike the Reeds, he listens to Jane with compassion. Understanding that Gateshead is no place for her, he gently suggests to Mrs. Reed that Jane be sent away to school. This to Jane sounds like a blessed escape, a chance for a new beginning. And so Jane is dispatched to Lowood Institution, a charity school for orphaned and destitute girls, overseen by the imposing and sanctimonious Mr. Naomi Brocklehurst. The very name Lowood seems to foreshadow the privations to come.
Jane's initial hopes for Lowood are quickly dampened. The institution is a place of grim austerity. The 80 pupils are subjected to meagre rations, often burnt or inedible, insufficient clothing against the biting cold, and a crushing routine of religious indoctrination and thankless chores. Mr. Brocklehurst, clergyman of considerable wealth, preaches a doctrine of harsh self-denial and mortification of the flesh for the girls. while his own family lives in luxury. He is a towering figure of hypocrisy, quick to condemn any sign of vanity or worldliness. In his young charges, even natural curls are deemed sinful. He publicly humiliates Jane shortly after her arrival, branding her a liar based on Mrs. Reed's malicious report, forcing her to stand on a stool as an example. This public shaming is a bitter blow to Jane, who values her integrity above all else, but it is in this moment of deep humiliation that she finds an unexpected solace. Helen Burns, a fellow student, older and remarkably serene, offers Jane a silent gesture of support, a faint smile that speaks volumes. Helen Burns becomes Jane's first true friend and a profound influence. Helen embodies a stoic, almost saintly Christian forbearance. She endures the cruel and unjust punishments meted out by teachers, like Miss Scatcherd, with quiet resignation, turning the other cheek and speaking of a spiritual life beyond earthly suffering. Jane, with her fiery spirit, struggles to understand Helen's passivity, but is deeply moved by her intellect, her kindness, and her unwavering faith. Their conversations are a lifeline for Jane. Helen introduces her to new ideas, shares her love of books, and offers a different perspective on how to cope with adversity. It is not violence that best overcomes hate, Helen tells her, nor vengeance that most certainly heals injury. Another beacon of light at Lowood is Miss Maria Temple, the superintendent. She is intelligent, compassionate, and just. Miss Temple recognizes Jane's potential and Helen's goodness. She clears Jane's name after writing to Mr. Lloyd and receiving his confirmation of Jane's truthful nature, and she provides the girls with moments of warmth and intellectual stimulation, often sharing her own meagre provisions with them. However, the harsh conditions at Lowood eventually take their toll. A devastating outbreak of typhus sweeps through the school, a consequence of the poor sanitation and malnutrition. Many girls fall ill, and several die. Helen Burns, already weakened by consumption, tuberculosis, succumbs to her illness, dying peacefully in Jane's arms. Helen's death is a profound loss for Jane. It solidifies her understanding of injustice in the world, but also strengthens her resolve. She cherishes Helen's memory, marking her grave years later with the word resurgam, I shall rise again. After the typhus epidemic exposes the scandalous neglect at Lowood, public outcry leads to improvements in the school's conditions. New, more humane benefactors step in. Jane remains at Lowood for 8 years in total, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher. She receives a solid education, develops her talents, especially in drawing, and gains a measure of self-reliance. But by the age of 18, Jane feels a stirring of restlessness, a yearning for new servitude, for a wider experience of life beyond the familiar walls of Lowood. Miss Temple marries and leaves the institution, severing Jane's last strong tie. Jane craves liberty, change, and a connection to the world she has only read about in books. Summoning her courage, she places an advertisement in the newspaper offering her services as a governess. To her delight, she receives a reply. A Mrs. Fairfax, housekeeper of Thornfield Hall in Millcote, requires a governess for a young girl. And so, with a mixture of apprehension and excitement, Jane embarks on the next chapter of her life.
Thornfield Hall is a grand, imposing, and somewhat gloomy manor steeped in history and secrets. Jane is greeted by the kindly, if rather conventional, Mrs. Fairfax, who turns out to be the housekeeper, not the mistress of the house, as Jane initially assumed. Her pupil is Adele Varence, a lively, somewhat spoiled, but ultimately endearing young French girl, the ward of Thornfield's absent master. Jane settles into her new role, finding a quiet contentment in teaching Adele and exploring the atmospheric old house, Yet there's an undercurrent of mystery. She hears strange, eerie laughter echoing through the corridors at night, a sound Mrs. Fairfax attributes to a servant named Grace Poole, whose behaviour seems odd and secluded. Jane, however, senses something more. The master of Thornfield, Mr. Edward Fairfax Rochester, is an enigma. He is often away, and his arrivals are unannounced and often abrupt. Jane first encounters him in a rather dramatic fashion. Riding home one icy evening, Rochester's horse slips and he takes a fall. Jane, out walking, comes to his aid, unaware of his identity. Their initial interactions are unconventional. Rochester is a man of about 35, with a stern, dark countenance and a manner that is by turns brusque, cynical, and surprisingly playful. He is a man of moods, capable of intense brooding and sudden flashes of sardonic wit. He is unlike anyone Jane has ever met. Rochester seems intrigued by Jane's plainness, her quiet composure, and her startlingly direct honesty. He engages her in probing, often challenging conversations, testing her intellect and her spirit. He enjoys her lack of flattery and her refusal to be intimidated by his wealth or status. "Do you think," he asks her, "because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as use, yea, and full as much heart." A sentiment Jane silently echoes. A strange, powerful connection begins to form between them, an intellectual and emotional affinity that transcends their differences in age, experience, and social standing. Jane finds herself drawn to his complex nature, his underlying melancholy, and the glimpses of a passionate, wounded soul beneath his often cynical exterior. The mysteries of Thornfield continue to deepen. One night, Jane is awakened by the smell of smoke and the sound of movement. She discovers a fire in Mr. Rochester's bedchamber. With remarkable courage and quick thinking, she rouses him and extinguishes the flames, saving his life. Rochester attributes the incident to Grace Poole, but Jane remains unconvinced. His gratitude towards her is immense, and the incident draws them even closer. Rochester often speaks cryptically of past sorrows and mistakes, hinting at a life filled with disappointment and a longing for redemption. He begins to confide in Jane, sharing aspects of his past, though never the full truth. He hosts grand parties filled with aristocratic guests, including the beautiful but haughty Blanche Ingram, whom everyone, including Jane herself, expects Rochester to marry. Jane observes these social rituals with a keen eye, acutely aware of her own plainness and inferior social position compared to the dazzling Miss Ingram. She endures Rochester's apparent courtship of Blanche with a pained heart, believing her own nascent feelings for him are hopeless. Yet Rochester continues to seek out Jane's company, preferring her candid conversation to the superficialities of his guests. One evening, when Rochester is away, a mysterious visitor named Mr. Mason arrives from the West Indies. His presence seems to deeply agitate Rochester upon his return. Later that night, a horrifying cry pierces the silence of Thornfield. Rochester enlists Jane's help in secretly tending to Mr. Mason, who has been viciously attacked, bitten, and stabbed. Again, Grace Poole is implicated, but the true nature of the danger lurking in the attic remains concealed.
After these unsettling events, Rochester's behaviour towards Jane becomes more intense, his affection more apparent. One beautiful midsummer evening in the Thornfield Gardens, he pours out his heart to Jane, speaking of his desire for a new life, for a love that is pure and true. He confesses his love for her and, to Jane's astonishment and overwhelming joy, asks her to be his wife. Jane, initially disbelieving, is swept away by the force of his passion and the sincerity of his declaration. Despite her lingering anxieties about their social disparity and the shadows that seem to hang over Thornfield, she accepts his proposal. For a brief period, she experiences a happiness so profound, it feels almost dreamlike. She has found love, acceptance, and a place where she truly belongs. Rochester showers her with affection and plans for their future, though Jane, true to her nature, resists his attempts to lavish her with expensive gifts, wishing to maintain her sense of independence. However, ominous portents begin to cloud their happiness. The night before the wedding, a strange, terrifying figure enters Jane's room, tears her wedding veil in two, and gazes at her with a wild, disfigured face. Jane faints from terror. Rochester dismisses it as a nightmare, but Jane is deeply disturbed. The wedding day arrives. Jane and Rochester stand before the altar in the quiet village church, but as the clergyman asks if anyone knows any impediment to the marriage, a voice rings out. Mr. Briggs, a London solicitor, steps forward, accompanied by Mr. Mason. They declare that Edward Fairfax Rochester cannot legally marry because he is already married. His wife, Bertha Antoinetta Mason, is alive and residing at Thornfield Hall.
The revelation is a cataclysm. Rochester, cornered and desperate, is forced to admit the truth. He leads the wedding party back to Thornfield and, with grim resolve, takes them to the hidden attic chambers. There, Jane beholds the source of the mysterious laughter and the nocturnal disturbances. Bertha Mason, Rochester's Creole wife, now a violent, mad woman, attended by Grace Poole. The sight is horrifying. Jane's world crumbles. The man she loves, the future she envisioned, all built on a foundation of deceit. Rochester explains the tragic history of his first marriage, a union arranged for fortune in Jamaica with a woman whose family had concealed a hereditary tendency towards insanity. He describes his years of misery, his search for solace, and his belief that his love for Jane could offer him redemption. Rochester pleads with Jane with all the desperate eloquence he possesses. He implores her to stay with him, to live with him as his wife in all but name, to defy convention and find happiness together across the sea. He argues that his marriage to Bertha is a sham, a legal tie devoid of love or sanity, and that Jane is his true soulmate, his second self. Jane is torn. Her love for Rochester is a consuming fire, and the thought of leaving him is an agony almost beyond bearing. She pities his suffering and understands his desperation. Yet, her deeply ingrained moral principles, her unshakable sense of self-respect, and her fear of becoming merely a mistress, a dependent, kept out of passion rather than principle, wage a fierce battle within her. In a moment of profound inner strength, Jane makes her agonizing choice. "I care for myself," she declares. "The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man." She cannot, will not be his mistress. She must leave Thornfield.
That very night, Jane flees Thornfield, taking almost nothing with her. She travels as far as her meagre funds will allow, then wanders the countryside for days. Destitute, starving, and utterly alone, she sleeps outdoors, begs for food, and experiences the harsh indifference of the world to an unprotected woman. It is a period of intense physical suffering and profound spiritual desolation. On the brink of collapse, guided by a distant light, she stumbles upon Moor House, the home of Diana and Mary Rivers, and their brother St. John, pronounced St. John. Rivers, a clergyman, initially turned away by their housekeeper, St. John himself finds her collapsed on the doorstep and, recognizing her desperate state, brings her inside. The Rivers siblings treat Jane with unexpected kindness and compassion. They nurse her back to health, offering her shelter and sustenance without intrusive questions. Jane, giving her name only as Jane Elliot to protect her identity, slowly recovers her strength and spirit. In their educated and refined household, Diana and Mary are intelligent, cultured young women, governesses themselves, and they quickly form a bond of friendship with Jane. St. John, however, is a more complex and formidable figure. He is handsome, dedicated, and deeply religious, but also cold, ambitious, and relentlessly driven by a sense of duty. He possesses an almost ascetic zeal, striving to suppress all human passion in service of his missionary calling. St. John discerns Jane's intelligence and capabilities. He offers her a position as the schoolmistress in the nearby village of Morton. Jane accepts gratefully, finding fulfillment in her work and her newfound independence. However modest, she dedicates herself to her pupils, creating a small, orderly world for herself. During this time, St. John observes Jane closely. He recognizes her strength of character, her resilience, and her capacity for self-sacrifice. One day, he uncovers her true identity, having seen her signature on a piece of artwork and piecing together information from Mr. Briggs. He then delivers astonishing news. Jane's uncle, John Eyre of Madeira, has died and left her a considerable fortune, £20,000. Not only is Jane now a wealthy woman, but St. John also reveals that her uncle was his uncle too. Diana, Mary, and St. John are her cousins, the family she never knew she had. This discovery brings Jane immense joy, a sense of belonging she has craved her entire life. Overjoyed, she insists on sharing her inheritance equally with her newfound cousins, ensuring their financial independence as well. St. John, however, has another proposition. His missionary zeal is all-consuming, and he is preparing to travel to India. He asks Jane to marry him and accompany him, not out of romantic love, which he openly disdains, but because he believes her qualities would make her an ideal missionary's wife, hardworking, resilient, and devoted to duty. Jane is deeply conflicted. St. John's offer appeals to her desire for a purposeful life, her admiration for his unwavering devotion, and her sense of duty. The prospect of service, of being valued for her strength rather than her appearance, is tempting. She respects St. John immensely, and a part of her feels she could find a kind of contentment in such a life. She agrees to go to India with him, but only as his sister, his fellow worker, not as his wife. St. John is relentless. He argues that such an arrangement would be unseemly and impractical. He pressures her, using his powerful will and moral authority to try and bend her to his vision. Jane feels herself wavering, almost succumbing to his cold, compelling logic, and the appeal of a life dedicated to a higher purpose. For Jane, who has yearned for connection, St. John represents a kind of austere love, a partnership in duty that seems almost holy.
At the very moment she is on the verge of yielding, as St. John utters a final prayer for her compliance, Jane experiences something extraordinary. She hears a voice, seemingly carried on the wind across the moors, a voice filled with anguish and longing, crying out her name, "Jane! Jane! Jane!" It is unmistakably Mr. Rochester's voice. This almost supernatural experience, a moment of profound psychic connection, shatters St. John's influence. Jane knows with an unshakable certainty that she must return to Rochester. Her heart, which had been swayed by St. John's vision of duty, now reasserts its claim. She realizes that a life without love, even a life of noble service, would be a living death for her. Her true calling lies not in suppressing her passions, but in embracing them in a union of equals. Empowered by this conviction and her newfound independence, Jane immediately leaves Moor House and journeys back to Thornfield. As she approaches, her heart is filled with trepidation. She finds Thornfield Hall a blackened, desolate ruin, destroyed by fire. From a local innkeeper, she learns the tragic story. Bertha Mason had set the fire. In the ensuing chaos, she had leaped to her death from the battlements. Mr. Rochester, in a desperate attempt to save his household and Bertha herself, had been severely injured. He had succeeded in getting the servants out, but was caught in the collapsing structure. Jane finds Rochester living in seclusion at Ferndean, a remote and gloomy grange he owns, attended by only 2 elderly servants. He is a changed man, blind, scarred, and having lost one hand. His former arrogance and Byronic posturing are gone, replaced by a deep melancholy, humility, and a profound sense of loss. When Jane reveals herself to him, Rochester can scarcely believe it. Their reunion is intensely emotional. He is initially overcome with despair, believing Jane has returned only out of pity, unable to comprehend that she could still love him in his broken state. But Jane's love is unwavering. She assures him that she has returned to be his companion, his wife. "Am I hideous, Jane?" he asks. "Very, sir. You always were, you know," she replies, with a tenderness that belies the teasing words. In his vulnerability, their roles are reversed. She is now the stronger, the one offering solace and support. Their connection is no longer that of master and governess, but of 2 souls who have suffered and found their way back to each other on terms of true equality.
With Bertha gone, and Jane now an independent woman of means, there are no longer any impediments to their union. They marry quietly, without fanfare. Jane becomes Rochester's eyes, his hands, his constant companion. Her presence brings light and life back into his world. Their life at Ferndean is one of peaceful, domestic happiness. Jane writes, "Reader, I married him." A simple statement for such a hard-won joy. She describes their deep companionship, their mutual dependence, and the profound love that binds them. After 2 years of marriage, Rochester begins to regain some sight in one eye, enough to see their firstborn son. Jane Eyre is a revolutionary novel for its time. It's a passionate assertion of a woman's right to emotional fulfillment, intellectual equality, and spiritual independence. Jane's journey from an oppressed orphan to a self-possessed woman who achieves happiness on her own terms, refusing to compromise her principles for either passionate love or austere duty, is what gives the novel its enduring power. She navigates the complexities of social class, religious hypocrisy, and the confining expectations placed upon women, ultimately forging her own path. It's a story that champions the strength of the individual spirit, the importance of self-respect, and the belief that true love must be a partnership of equals, rooted in mutual understanding and esteem.